Okay, I think that I am now recording. This is a mini lecture on Woman Warrior, No Name Woman, the first chapter. Um, okay, so we start out the book with a problem, which is that the text is a postmodern text, and this becomes clear after reading a bunch of it, but is actually apparent on the cover. So I'm going to show you the cover because I don't think that you have the book. It says Woman Warrior, Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts. And I'm not sure if this is backwards, but it says right here, memoir. And then if I go to the back of the book, it says right here, fiction. So that's a problem right away. Is it a fiction or is it a memoir? A memoir is not a fiction. A memoir is stuff that happened. So it's hard to understand what the genre is. Okay, so this is a postmodern text. This is what postmodern texts are like. A postmodern text delights in paradox. It delights in bending genres. Like you don't know if it's a memoir, true or false, memoir or fiction. It delights in it denies the certainty or absolute knowledge. It delights in that, in denying absolute knowledge. It is an assertion of the primacy of individual perception and especially culture in creating reality. So it's not just that it's not just that individuals see things differently, it's also that cultures determine how individuals see things. Individual perception is not paramount, culture is paramount. So that undermines our understanding that we know what is real, because when we are determined by our cultures, then we don't necessarily understand what is real and what is not. And this is especially important in a book about two cultures being mixed in one person. There is the idea of the self is called into question. The self is treated as a myth, another story, or a set of stories created by stories. That's what this chapter is. It's a set of stories about a person, or actually three people, the mother, the daughter, and the no-name woman. The postmodern work of art is a reaction against what postmodernists call totalizing theories that they identify with modernism. So in modernism, you have Marxism and Freudian psychology and capitalist ideology and an unquestioned faith in democracy and so on. There are all kinds of totalizing theories. Marxism is a totalizing theory. It explains the entirety of history, or it says that it can. And so all of these things are taken into, are undermined and are not believed. The totalizing theories have led us to a bad place, 2 world wars and nuclear weapons and so on, and the world is not better for them. Okay, so how does this work in the book? For example, on page 10, well, I don't know exactly what pages you have, the author surmises in fiction mode about the no-name woman attempting to beautify herself. So if I go to page 10, I'm reading this, even as the paragraph starts, even as her hair lured her imminent lover, as many other men looked at her. Uncles, cousins, nephews, brothers would have looked too, and had they been home between journeys, and so on. It talks about her hair endlessly. And then on page 12, the author, that's the no-name woman who she's talking about. But on page 12, she writes in memoir mode, so this is true, we're supposed to take this as true, about her own complicated relation to beautifying herself. She says that if I made myself American pretty so that the 5 or 6 Chinese boys in the class fell in love with me, everybody else and all these other races of people would fall in love with me too. So she doesn't want to do that. So when she's talking about the no-name woman whom she never has met, is she talking about herself? Is she projecting onto the no-name woman, or is she telling a story that's true about Chinese village life of her ancestors? In the postmodern text, there's no answer to that question that I just asked. The nature of what is real is in flux. Okay, so what are some of the meanings of no-name woman? So these can be things that have occurred to you, but I want to know how they fit together. So the no-name woman is denied individuality. The speaker is unable to overcome her failure to inquire about her aunt and find out more about her life and individuality. She never finds out the woman's name. There is a sense that she is no name because she is a woman. But on the other hand, there are no-name men in the chapter too, but the chapter is not about them. This is a chapter that's very, very much specifically about the woman as a woman. She does things that men can't do. She gives birth. There is the implication of American values in this particular idea of the name of the chapter. To be an individual and have a name is to exist in American culture. But the story tells us that that value is wrong. Inside the story, the value is about community, not individuality. And so which value are we supposed to place higher? The story says that patriarchy is correct and to be a feminist is wrong. But we can't necessarily know to which value we're supposed to adhere right away. Although there does seem to be an American audience implied. In that way, in that sense, they would value individualism. So the rhetorical choices in the telling of the story of the aunt who died. There's the nested story. So first there's the mother telling a story to the daughter, and then inside of that, there's the daughter telling the story to us that she's kind of making up. So that's nested. And then the outside of that is the daughter or the author telling us the story of her mother telling her the story. So there are at least 3 parentheses there. There's the idea of a surmise. That's a rhetorical choice. A surmise is a creating of a fiction about a character, sort of weaving a fiction about the character that cannot be known, but seems to make sense for various reasons. There's irony and paradox all over these stories, and I'll show you where. And I'll show you some places. There is repetition. We get told the story of the woman many times, and we get told it in different ways. So the author repeats the story and retells it in order to combat this absence of knowledge. And she can't. She can't overcome the absence of knowledge. It's just there. She feels guilty that she doesn't know these things, as if she betrayed the aunt. And you can see that at the end of the chapter. But that makes no sense. That is irrational, and yet it is perfectly understandable. The effect of the first telling of the story, the mom's warning, what we get there is a form of parenting which is overwhelming. To tell a story that ends in death and despair of a young girl. Although maybe that's not what the mom said. We don't know what the mom said because maybe the author is making up in her surmise form all of that stuff. In any case, this story does end in the death of the no-name woman, but we don't know exactly how harsh the story was when it was first told. In any case, it seems like it's a panic on the part of the mother that the girl, the author, who is becoming a woman, is becoming a sexual being. And so the mother is telling her this extremely harsh story that the mother says the mother should not tell the daughter. And so this is like some kind of almost hysterical panic on the part of the mother that tries to crush something in the daughter. And the daughter tries to resist. So the chapter, not the story in it, is an attempt to transcend this overbearing parenting experience. But then the daughter is not saying necessarily that this is what Chinese culture is like. She says, maybe this is just what my mom is like. Okay. There is a feeling that the act of surmise, which is to say, doing the fiction writing about what happened to this woman, is an attempt to resurrect the woman. So there's a feeling that there's a resurrection on the part of the author. The author wants to resurrect her. There is a resistance to this flattening and misuse of human stories that the mother does. The mother says, see, don't have sex. But the author is trying to insist that this no-name woman is an individual, which he can't ultimately achieve because you never find out her name. That is an American value, to make her an individual. But the fact is that the American value is not achieved. And so does that mean that the author is saying that Chinese values ultimately triumph, at least in her, over the American values that she has learned by growing up in the United States? Or is it that the mere attempt to humanize this character is American? So there's always a mixture of these two cultures. All right, but there's also a sense that the attempt to resurrect the no-name woman is self-serving. It doesn't help the no-name woman, she's dead. There is a resistance to the speaker's own family strictures. So really, the daughter is fighting with her mother. She's not resurrecting anybody. There's also an irony because the story is about a complete domination of the community over the individual. But the storyteller is resisting this domination by telling the story. So there's another irony in the nested story because the mother in telling the story is committing a paradox or an irony. The mother both tells the story and then represses it. She says, I'm going to tell you a story and then you can't tell the story again. She represses it at once, but by telling it, she defies her own message not to tell the story. That is to say, by telling the story, the mother defies the mother's message. At the close of the framing device of the mother telling the story, the narrator quotes her, "Don't tell anyone you had an aunt. Your father does not want to hear her name." On the one hand, the mother is obeying her husband by telling the daughter to repress this knowledge of the story of the aunt. And on the other hand, she has defied her husband because she told the daughter of the story. And thus the patriarchal message, the really heavy-handed patriarchal message of the story, is undermined by the fact that the story gets told. So why does the novel begin with a story? I'm calling it a novel arbitrarily. Is it a novel or a memoir? I don't know. Why does the novel begin with the story if it's an immigration novel? So to begin with, a lost heritage of women resisting the conditions of patriarchy and community back in China before coming to the US may explain why the US is attractive for both Chinese women and men. This is a story of a woman who has been lost. Immigrant stories are always about people who have been lost, people who didn't make it, like the Middle Passage, for example, during the Middle Passage among African Americans. This is a story of a woman who died before she could even get a chance to think about coming to the United States. Not that she necessarily would have done so. Okay. I'm going to look at the idea of history first, and then I'm going to look at the last paragraph, and that'll be all for this little tiny lecture. So there is history in the chapter. It takes place at a certain time. There are dates in the chapter, the 1920s, for example, and the immigration of Chinese men to the United States to work. The author is trying to reach history through the story of the aunt. It uses history, but history is also the point to flesh out a historical moment for us using this character. But the thing about history in the text is that history is very specific as well as general. Chinese families living today most likely share almost nothing specific with this story. Or they might, but they may very well share general cultural things with the story. The story, this novel or book is from 1975. It's published in 1975 when Kingston is 35 years old. Kingston was born in 1940. In 1940, there was no communist China yet. And this is before the transformation of China from a communist country into a capitalist country with no political freedom, which is what it is today. There was not yet a great opening of Chinese immigration from China that began in 1965. There were very few Chinese people in the United States. Now there are millions of Chinese people in the United States, literally. Not that Chinese people represent a large group compared to the rest of the United States, but the experiences of Chinese people coming to this country are not shown in this particular story. It is particular after all. But the general idea of the problem of mixing the old country and the individualistic new country is something that not only Chinese, but other immigrant groups can identify with. All right, so now I'm looking at the last paragraph of the chapter. My aunt haunts me, her ghost drawn to me because now, after 50 years of neglect, I alone devote pages of paper to her, though not origamied into houses and clothes. I do not think she always means me well. I am telling on her, and she was a spite suicide, drowning herself in the drinking water. The Chinese are always very frightened of the drowned one, whose weeping ghost, wet hair hanging and skin bloated, waits silently by the water to pull down a substitute. So the last paragraph shows a paradox. On the one hand, the author is seeking to escape from her heritage, and on the other hand, she can't escape from it because she partakes of the superstitions that she ridicules or at least exposes in the chapter. She points out how those superstitions cause problems and are prejudiced and are even murderous at times. So it is as if in the last paragraph she is questioning and undermining the validity of her own thought processes. Or she is merely pointing out how the way she thinks is culturally determined, not individual, as she might prefer. She can't control these things. Okay, so I hope that that's a good introduction to the book and how it is complicated and interesting. And we will talk about more of these developments and these kinds of paradoxes and ironies in the chapters that follow. So the thing to keep in mind is always that the fabric of fiction versus reality is always in question in the text on purpose. And that's one of the interesting things that's woven together with the conflicts between Chinese and American culture. Okay, I'm going to stop there.